The morning the war began, I was sitting on my porch sipping lukewarm coffee from my world's okayest grandpa mug, watching my cat Cleo judge the world from her usual spot on the railing. Then I saw her, Eleanor Vance, marching down the sidewalk like she was leading the D-Day invasion, armed with a clipboard, a fanny pack, and the unearned confidence of a woman who once fined me $50 for wind chimes being too whimsical. My stomach sank. I knew that look in her eyes. That look meant tyranny was about to be enforced again. I'd lived in Ashford Pines for 33 years, raised my kids here, retired here, planted roses, and watered every inch of my front lawn with love. But in all those years, nothing had tested my patience like Eleanor Vance and her iron-fisted rule of the HOA. She had turned our once peaceful community into a bureaucratic nightmare of pool float restrictions, grass blade inspections, and mailbox audits. And I was her favorite target. Why? Because I was the last man standing, the last one not afraid to push back, the last one to say, "No, Eleanor, I will barbecue on my driveway if I damn well please." But I didn't know she was about to cross a line so outrageous, so personal. It would lead to one of the greatest, weirdest, and most legendary acts of neighborhood rebellion this town had ever seen. She didn't just take my pool key. She took my peace, my routine, my morning laps, my happy place. And so, I did what any emotionally grounded, slightly unhinged 68-year-old man with a sense of justice would do. I filled the pool with 10,000 piranhas. But before the fish, before the headlines, before the HOA meetings exploded into screaming matches and viral TikToks, it all began with that one walk. Eleanor, stumping toward the community pool like she owned it, which, in her mind, she basically did. I noticed it right away when I got there 20 minutes later. The gate was locked. Strange. I always had the key. I'm one of the few left from the original homeowners, grandfathered into unrestricted pool access before Eleanor's new guidelines for water-based conduct nonsense took over. I reached into my shorts pocket. Empty. Checked my bag. Nothing. My towel. Not there either. Then, hanging from the inside of the pool fence, taunting me like a shiny metallic middle finger, was my key, hooked onto Eleanor's monstrous clipboard with a fluorescent tag that said, "Suspended." I stared at it for a long moment. Cleo meowed in protest, probably feeling the injustice too. My morning routine was sacred. 10 laps, quiet thinking, peaceful water. Gone just like that. And I knew exactly who was responsible. I walked back to her house, which was only 5 doors down from mine, but felt like marching through enemy territory. Her yard was so perfect it made you want to throw dirt on it out of spite. Plastic flamingos, color-coordinated garden gnomes. She had even painted her curb numbers to match her begonias. I rang the bell 3 times. She opened the door wearing her favorite HOA t-shirt, a navy blue one that read, "Respect the rules or leave the pool." Her fake smile stretched like rubber over her teeth. "Well, Arthur, what can I do for you this fine morning?" "You stole my pool key, Eleanor." "I reclaimed it," she said without missing a beat. "You were in violation of HOA Regulation 7B, subsection 12.3. I blinked. What in the hell is subsection 12.3? She pulled out a laminated sheet. Of course, it was laminated. No personal furniture may be left unattended in shared spaces for more than 13 minutes. Your lounge chair was by the pool for 22, Arthur. 22. That's almost a double violation. I let out a short laugh. "Eleanor, I set my chair down to use the restroom and came back to find you treating me like a criminal. The rules are for everyone." "No, they are for everyone else. You just weaponized them." She squinted at me like I were a weed in her flower bed. "If you want your privileges reinstated, you'll need to attend the next compliance hearing." "A compliance hearing? For using a chair?" She smiled again, more teeth this time, less warmth. "We have standards here." I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't just about the chair or the pool. It was about every absurd rule she'd shoved down our throats over the years. The ban on golden wind spinners, the Halloween decoration curfews, the noise complaint she filed because a child's laughter exceeded 65 decibels. Eleanor didn't just want order. She wanted control, and it had to stop. "Fine," I said. "But just so you know, this is war." She laughed, but it was nervous now. "Oh, Arthur, you're adorable." As I walked away, I said the words that would echo across the neighborhood later that week. "Hope to fish like chlorine." She didn't understand then. No one did. But something had snapped, and I wasn't going to fight her with letters and hearings. I was going to fight her with chaos, with precision, with teeth. Back at home, Walter was waiting on my porch with 2 Diet Pepsis and a look that said, "What now?" I told him everything. About the key, the accusation, the laminated regulation. He listened silently, then cracked his soda and took a sip. "So, what's the plan?" he asked. "I'm going to fill the pool with piranhas." He stared at me. "You serious?" As a heart attack, he leaned back, looked toward the sky, and said, "Well, damn. Let's do it." And just like that, Operation Bite Back was born. What Eleanor didn't realize, what she never realized, was that while she ruled by rules, I ruled by stories. And I was about to give the people of Ashford Pines one they'd never forget. Walter showed up the next morning with a notebook, duct tape, and a suspicious grin on his face that only meant one thing. He was in, fully committed. That's the thing about old friends. When you say something like, "I'm going to fill the community pool with piranhas," most people would laugh, maybe call a doctor, maybe call the cops. Walter? Walter brought a notebook and started drawing diagrams. We sat at my kitchen table, coffee between us, Cleo perched on the counter watching us like we were planning a heist, which, in a way, we were. The first thing we needed was knowledge, not just about piranhas, though that was a big part of it, but also about Eleanor's schedule. We needed to know when she inspected the pool, how often she visited the clubhouse, who her little HOA spies were. Because, oh yes, she had spies. They walked their dogs in suspiciously perfect loops around the block, always pausing in front of houses with slightly overgrown shrubs. Walter called them the Nets. We had to move in silence. While Walter focused on surveillance, I dove into the world of carnivorous fish. Let me tell you, the internet is a terrifying place. Within minutes, I was looking at videos of piranhas tearing through raw chicken like it was tissue paper. I found articles warning against putting them in outdoor bodies of water, warnings that included phrases like potentially catastrophic consequences. That only made me more curious. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, of course. I just wanted to make a point, a very dramatic, unforgettable point. After a few hours of research, I discovered that there were actually 2 types of piranhas commonly sold, red-bellied and black. The red-bellied ones were the stars of the horror stories, the frenzied chompers with a bad attitude and sharp little teeth. They were aggressive in groups, quick, and, according to one very passionate aquarium enthusiast on a forum, not suitable for beginners. I figured if I was going to be remembered, I might as well go all in. The problem was, you couldn't just walk into PetSmart and say, "Hi, where do you keep the aquatic nightmares?" So, Walter and I drove 2 hours to a specialty exotic pet shop run by a guy named Morty, who smelled like shrimp and sounded like he hadn't talked to a human being in years. Morty had everything: tanks full of electric eels, lizards the size of dachshunds, and a tarantula named Meatball. When I mentioned piranhas, his eyes lit up like a man who'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. We didn't buy the fish that day. That would have been reckless. We needed time, a plan, a secure location to keep them before the big splash. Instead, we asked Morty questions, lots of them. How do you transport them? What do they eat? How long can they survive in chlorine? Morty was a fountain of knowledge. "Chlorine will kill them eventually," he said, "but they'll be fine for a few hours. Long enough to make an impression." I nodded slowly, the gears in my brain turning. Walter scribbled everything down in his notebook like we were planning a government operation. Back in the neighborhood, things were heating up. Eleanor had posted new signage at the pool. Absolutely no entry without HOA approval, in bold, underlined, red letters. She had also added a laminated FAQ tape to the fence that listed offenses like excessive splashing and loud sunscreen application. People were starting to get fed up. My neighbor Agnes, a sweet widow who hosted knitting circles by the pool, came to me almost in tears after Eleanor reprimanded her for bringing an unauthorized crochet hook. That's when I knew it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. I started dropping subtle hints at the neighborhood potluck. I brought fish tacos and labeled them, inspired by what's coming. During morning walks, I'd say things like, "You know, nature has a funny way of restoring balance." People began whispering. Something was happening. No one knew what, but something. And Eleanor? Eleanor was so busy counting blades of grass and lecturing people about garbage can placement that she didn't notice the shift in the air. The final piece of the puzzle was pool access. Access was tricky now that Eleanor had changed the locks again. But Walter, bless him, still had a key from his time on the HOA board years ago. Eleanor must have forgotten about that little detail. We waited until a night when rain was in the forecast, knowing fewer people would be out. Then, under the cover of dark clouds and thunder, we moved in. Walter kept watch while I pried open the maintenance panel and checked the water intake. We dropped the temperature gauge into the deep end to make sure the water wouldn't shock the fish. Everything checked out. The next morning, we did a dry run. No fish, just gear testing. We wanted to see how long it would take to get in and out. We practiced carrying the sealed containers, checking for leaks, even timed how long it took to climb over the back fence in case of a fast getaway. We treated it like a bank robbery, only instead of cash, we were dealing in carnivorous fish. Then came the unexpected obstacle. Eleanor announced an emergency HOA inspection at the pool, scheduled for the same day we planned to release the piranhas. It was almost like she knew. Walter and I met that night in my garage, surrounded by hoses, buckets, and a very disgruntled cat. We debated postponing, maybe coming up with a backup plan, but I was done backing down. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about standing up to the absurdity, to the control, to the way she had turned our community into a joke with no punchline. So, we moved the plan up one day earlier. Riskier, but doable. We called Morty, arranged the pickup, and by dawn the next morning, the fish were in our possession. Dozens of sleek, toothy swimmers in sealed containers that gurgled ominously in the back of Walter's truck. As the sun began to rise, we parked 2 blocks away, carried them by hand through alleyways and side paths, moving like shadows in a spy film. The moment we opened the containers and poured them into the deep end, there was a strange silence. Then the water churned, ever so slightly. You couldn't see them at first, not really, but the knowledge that they were there was enough. I stood at the edge, watching the ripples fade, and whispered, "Swim free, my bitey little friends." Then we vanished. The pool sat still, ordinary, perfectly blue. But underneath, it was alive. The trap was set. The neighborhood was about to learn what happens when you push an old man too far. The next morning began like any other in Ashford Pines, with birds chirping, sprinklers hissing, and dogs doing their usual business on meticulously trimmed lawns. But there was something different in the air, a tension, a whisper of chaos humming beneath the surface. Eleanor, as always, was up early, clipboard in hand, patrolling the neighborhood with her usual speed-walking strut. Her visor sat perched on her head like a crown, and her fanny pack bounced with each self-righteous step. She didn't know it yet, but her kingdom was about to fall spectacularly. Walter and I sat in my front room, peeking through the blinds like 2 teenagers watching their prank unfold. We had front-row seats to history. The piranhas had been released just before dawn, silently slipping into the pool's calm blue water. We didn't know how long they'd last in the chlorine, but Morty had promised at least a few hours of moderate aquatic menace. That was more than enough. Today was the big HOA inspection, and Eleanor would be leading her army straight into the mouth of madness. The inspection began promptly at 9 o'clock. Eleanor arrived at the pool with 2 other board members in tow. Martha, who once cried at a board meeting because someone planted sunflowers without prior approval, and Bernard, who looked like he hated his life but was too spineless to say no to Eleanor. They were dressed in matching polo shirts and khakis, like some twisted version of the Ghostbusters, but instead of trapping ghosts, they hunted violations of the noise ordinance clause. We watched as Eleanor pulled out her master pool key and dramatically turned the lock. She flung the gate open and stepped inside like she was entering the Vatican. Her eyes scanned the area, looking for infractions, for rogue pool noodles or unsanctioned sandals. Everything appeared normal. She nodded to Martha, who began taking pictures of the pool chairs. Bernard scribbled something in a tiny notepad, possibly about how miserable he was. Then Eleanor stepped toward the water. She paused, tilted her head. Something wasn't right. She leaned over slightly, peering into the pool. The surface was calm, but there was movement, small subtle ripples, almost too subtle. But Eleanor, being the nosy bloodhound she was, didn't ignore them. She squinted, took a step closer, another. Her white tennis shoes touched the edge of the pool. Then she bent down to get a better look. And then it happened. One of the piranhas broke the surface, just for a second, just long enough to show its teeth, and slapped the water with its tail. Eleanor let out a shriek so high-pitched a nearby bird fell out of a tree. She stumbled back, waving her clipboard like it was a weapon, yelling something incoherent about wildlife violations. Martha screamed and dropped her phone into the pool. Bernard froze in place, eyes wide, holding his notepad like a shield. From across the street, other neighbors began to gather. The noise, the shrieking, it all drew them in like moths to a flame. Mr. Peterson came out in his robe, Mrs. Chun brought her binoculars, and Agnes from the knitting group rolled up in her motorized scooter with a bowl of popcorn in her lap. This was the kind of drama the HOA usually tried to suppress, but now it was playing out live, in broad daylight, with the villain center stage and surrounded by invisible predators. Eleanor was in full meltdown mode. She demanded someone call animal control. She accused teenagers of releasing marine criminals. She tried to contact the county about water contamination. But the best moment, the one that would later go viral on 3 separate TikTok accounts, came when she tried to assert her authority over the fish. She stood at the edge of the pool, arms crossed, and shouted, "As the elected head of this HOA, I command you to vacate these premises immediately." A beat of silence followed. Then another piranha surfaced. It didn't respond, obviously, because it was a fish, but it did leap just enough to splash her visor right off her head and into the water. The crowd gasped. Someone clapped. And Eleanor? She looked like she'd seen a ghost riding a shark. I couldn't hold it anymore. I stepped out onto my lawn and clapped slowly, the way they do in the movies. Heads turned. Neighbors stared. Eleanor's eyes locked onto mine like twin lasers fueled by rage and humiliation. I smiled, a calm, satisfied smile, the kind of smile that says, "You messed with the wrong grandpa." She stormed toward me, soaking wet from a near slip into the pool and flailing her clipboard like it was a legal document. "You," she shrieked. "You did this." "Did what?" I asked innocently. "You mean expose the dangers of unchecked HOA power and excessive rule enforcement?" "Guilty as charged. You filled the pool with man-eating monsters." "Correction, fish. And honestly, they've got better manners than some people I know." Laughter erupted from the crowd. Agnes nearly dropped her popcorn. Even Bernard cracked a smile. Eleanor looked around, suddenly realizing the tide had turned. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They were entertained, relieved, even grateful. The Eleanor era was crumbling, and the piranhas were the final straw. She sputtered something about lawsuits and public endangerment, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. The crowd grew. Someone set up a lawn chair. A teenager flew a drone overhead to film everything. Within minutes, phones were out, hashtags were forming, and videos were uploading. I heard someone mutter, "This is better than cable." Animal control did eventually show up, confused and unimpressed. One of the officers asked if the fish were really dangerous. I said, "Only if you're a bully in a pantsuit with a god complex." He laughed and gave me a fist bump. By noon, the piranhas were kept, removed, and relocated to a nearby aquatic facility. Morty handled that part personally, thrilled to finally have a story worthy of his tarantula named Meatball. Eleanor, however, wasn't so lucky. Her authority shattered, her reputation in shambles, and her visor forever claimed by the jaws of poetic justice. She stumped back to her house, without another word. The pool was closed for the day, but nobody cared. They had witnessed history. The legend of the pool piranha uprising spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, whispered in every backyard and rewatched at every dinner table. Walter joined me on the porch later that evening. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip behind the houses. Cleo curled up between us, purring softly. "Well," he said, sipping his beer, "that went better than I expected." "I told you," I replied, grinning. "Sometimes you've got to fight HOA fire with fish." We clinked our bottles together as the last rays of sunlight touched the still water of the pool, now calm, empty, and legendary. The next morning, the entire neighborhood buzzed like a beehive that had just discovered it could sting back. You couldn't walk 5 feet without hearing someone whisper about the piranha incident, or as it had already been dubbed by a group of local teens, the splashing. Lawn chairs were set up outside the pool fence like it was the site of a historical monument. Someone even chalked a little fish mural on the sidewalk with the words, "They swam so we could be free." It would have been hilarious if it wasn't also so completely true. Eleanor, of course, was nowhere to be seen. Her blinds were drawn, her mailbox untouched. Rumor had it she had a full-blown meltdown after the HOA board refused to file an emergency motion to ban aquatic life from the premises. According to Martha, who had very quickly distanced herself from Eleanor after the whole visor debacle, Eleanor had locked herself in her sunroom, shouting about bylaws and betrayal. It was the first time in over a decade that Ashford Pines had gone a full 24 hours without receiving at least one passive-aggressive HOA email. The silence was heavenly. But like all tyrants, Eleanor wasn't going down without a fight. 2 days later, a special HOA meeting was announced. The flyer was delivered to every doorstep at 6 a.m. sharp by a clearly sleep-deprived Bernard, who looked like he hadn't blinked in hours. The meeting was to address recent acts of vandalism, anarchy, and fish-based terrorism. I had to read that last part 3 times just to believe it. Eleanor was coming for me. She was going to try to spin the entire situation into some crime of epic proportions, and I was ready. Walter and I spent the day preparing, not with lawyers or apologies, but with something far more powerful: witnesses, stories, and receipts. We talked to every neighbor we could, gathering statements about Eleanor's years of absurdity. The time she fined the Millers for having non-standard Halloween cobwebs. The time she banned yoga in the park because the stretching was suggestive. The time she reported a 10-year-old's lemonade stand as an unlicensed business. People were done, ready to speak. The fish had broken the spell. That evening, the clubhouse was packed like a courtroom drama. Folding chairs lined every corner, and people were even standing in the back. Eleanor entered last, dressed in all black like she was attending a funeral, probably her own reign. She walked up to the podium with her usual forced smile, but there was something different this time. A twitch in her eye, a nervous tremble in her hand. She knew the tide had turned. The meeting began with Eleanor reading from a prepared statement. She spoke of danger, recklessness, and how the incident had traumatized the community. She called it an act of biological aggression and claimed the HOA bylaws allowed for the expulsion of anyone who endangered public safety. Her voice cracked once, just a little, when she said endangered, and I could tell she knew she was losing them. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then Bernard cleared his throat and said, "We'll now open the floor for community response." That's when it happened. Agnes, sweet old knitting circle Agnes, rolled her scooter to the center aisle and raised her voice like a woman twice her size. "Eleanor," she said, "you fined me last year for putting a pink flamingo in my garden. You said it was tacky. You called my gnome collection aesthetic pollution. I didn't say a word. But now you're standing there pretending to be the victim after years of bullying this community? You lost your visor, not your soul." The room burst into applause. Then came Mr. Peterson, then Mrs. Chun, then a whole line of neighbors who, one by one, stood up and unloaded their grievances. It was like the neighborhood had been waiting for this exact moment, a public airing of every slight, every insult, every ludicrous citation. I sat quietly through it all, sipping water and watching Eleanor's face slowly melt into a mask of disbelief. She had no control now. Her own rules had cornered her. Finally, Walter stood up and gestured toward me. "This man may have brought in a few fish," he said, "but what he really brought back was our spirit. We're tired of being policed over porch lights and paper lanterns. We're tired of living under a rule book thicker than a Bible and twice as punishing. Arthur didn't endanger us. He reminded us we're neighbors, not inmates." More applause. Someone started clapping above their head like we were at a concert. Eleanor stood again, trembling. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You're all going to let one man turn this neighborhood into a zoo." A teen in the back yelled, "Better a zoo than a dictatorship." The crowd roared. Then Bernard, of all people, stood up. For the first time ever, he looked Eleanor directly in the eyes. "We've taken a vote," he said quietly. "The board has decided. You're being removed as HOA president, effective immediately." The silence that followed was electric. Eleanor blinked twice. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like a fish. "How ironic. You can't do that." "We just did," Bernard replied. She turned to the audience, looking for support, but all she saw were folded arms, raised brows, and a few people holding up their phones. She knew it was over. Without another word, she picked up her clipboard, her binder, and her shattered ego and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her with a thud that sounded like the final nail in a very overdue coffin. The crowd sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was cheering, not just for me, not just for the fish, but for the fact that finally, the HOA belonged to the people again. After the meeting, folks gathered outside in little clusters, talking, laughing, making plans for a community barbecue, one that didn't require pre-approved burger brands or certified charcoal. A group of kids chalked fish drawings on the sidewalk again. Someone offered me a slice of pie. Agnes gave me a hug so hard it cracked my back. Walter leaned over and said, "Well, you've done it now. You're a legend." I smiled, finally allowing myself to breathe. Took a few teeth to make it happen, but yeah, the stars were out. The pool shimmered under the streetlights, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a neighborhood again. Not a battleground, not a prison, just home. And while Eleanor's reign was over, something new had begun, something better, something that didn't require a clipboard to function. And all it took was a little bite. The first morning after Eleanor's dethroning felt like the neighborhood had taken a deep, collective breath, the kind of breath you don't realize you've been holding for years. For the first time in what felt like forever, there were no passive-aggressive notes taped to front doors, no citations for faded house numbers, and no surprise inspections of flower beds. The silence was different now, peaceful, not tense. I woke up and walked outside with my coffee, barefoot, standing in the dewy grass like a man who had just survived a long, ridiculous war. Cleo the cat followed me, tail high, as if she too sensed the air had changed. It didn't take long for things to start shifting in Ashford Pines. The clubhouse bulletin board, once a rigid wall of laminated rules and Eleanor-typed manifestos, now featured a hand-drawn flyer advertising a neighborhood movie night. Someone had scrawled, "Pool party this Friday. BYO fun," in colorful chalk beneath it. And right there, smack in the middle of it all, was a photo someone had printed out and pinned up. A still frame from the viral video of Eleanor getting splashed in the face by a piranha, her visor midair, her mouth wide open in horror. Someone had written in red marker underneath, "Never forget." The legend of the Piranhas spread further than I expected. A local news crew came by to do a feel-good segment. They interviewed neighbors, captured dramatic reenactments, and even tried to get a statement from Eleanor. She slammed the door in their face. Meanwhile, the video had racked up over 2 million views online, accompanied by dozens of reaction clips, remixes, and a surprisingly catchy trap remix of her scream. I got recognized at the grocery store. A teenager stopped me and said, "Yo, you're the fish guy?" I smiled and said, "I prefer local legend," but I wasn't going to argue. The pool reopened officially 3 days later, freshly cleaned, piranha-free, and brimming with actual joy. There were floats of all shapes and sizes. Kids ran around laughing. Someone had brought a speaker playing 80s hits. Walter wore his flamingo swim trunks, which had been banned under Eleanor's petty moderation policy, but were now the unofficial uniform of poolside rebellion. I sat on a lounge chair that I deliberately placed slightly crooked just to prove I could. A few neighbors stopped by to thank me personally, not in a dramatic way, just quiet, grateful moments that said more than words ever could. Later that evening, Walter and I sat on my porch again, the same way we always did. The sun had dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. He cracked open a soda and handed it to me. We didn't say much at first, just sat there, letting the quiet settle. "You think it'll last?" he finally asked. "The peace," I said, sipping my drink. "Maybe not forever, but long enough to matter." Walter nodded slowly. "You know, when you first said piranhas, I thought you were losing it." I said, chuckling. "Just not the way you thought." He laughed too, a warm, genuine laugh that sounded like home. "Still can't believe you actually pulled it off." I shrugged. Sometimes it takes a little bite to wake people up. As the stars came out, Cleo curled up between us, purring softly. The world felt slower in the best way, like we had finally found the rhythm we were always meant to live in. No one telling us how many wind chimes were too many. No one measuring the height of our grass with a ruler. Just life, plain and sweet and good. Then, just as I was about to head inside, I noticed a small envelope on my doormat. No postage, no return address, just my name written in sharp, tight cursive. I picked it up, feeling the strange weight of it. Inside was a single page. It read, "To Mr. Hooper, I hope you're pleased with yourself. You may have turned the neighborhood against me, but you haven't won. I've taken the liberty of forming a new HOA in a new neighborhood, one without flamingo shorts or ridiculous aquatic stunts. It's called Serenity Glen, and it will be everything Ashford Pines was supposed to be. P.S. Visors are mandatory. Sincerely, Eleanor Vance." I stared at the letter for a long moment, then burst out laughing. Walter raised an eyebrow, and I handed it to him. He read it silently, then chuckled. "She really started another HOA? Yep, Serenity Glen. Sounds like a cult. She included, visors are mandatory." That's real commitment. We laughed until our sides hurt. I folded the letter back up and slipped it into the mailbox marked Return to Sender. Maybe one day someone in Serenity Glen would stumble across it and realize exactly what kind of storm they were letting in. The days rolled on. The neighborhood began to hum with new energy. People hosted porch concerts. A group of teenagers organized a community scavenger hunt. Someone even put googly eyes on all the street signs just for fun. And not once did anyone get fined. Freedom had never tasted sweeter. One afternoon, I got a knock at the door. It was Martha. She looked nervous, like someone arriving at a confessional booth. She held a pie, lemon meringue by the looks of it. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she said, for going along with all of it. The rules, the citations, the fear. I guess I thought that's just how neighborhoods had to work. I took the pie and gave her a nod. They don't. Not anymore. She smiled, and for the first time, it didn't look forced. Thank you for reminding us of that. When she left, I set the pie on the counter, cut a slice, and sat down with Cleo on my lap. As she purred, I looked around my quiet little home and thought about how far we'd come, from laminated threats to neighborhood laughter, from silence to music, from fear to fish. In the end, I didn't just get my pool key back. I got my neighborhood back, my peace, my mornings, my crooked lounge chair. And maybe, just maybe, I proved that even at 68, you're never too old to make waves. And as for Eleanor, well, may the fish gods have mercy on Serenity Glen, because I sure won't.